Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at Washington State University, Vancouver, and from our statewide remote viewing locations. My name is Marcia Ostrom. I'm Associate Professor in the School of the Environment, and today marks the return of the Lane Lecture Series in Environmental Science. I have been looking forward to this day for a long time, and on behalf of our department, the School of the Environment, and our wider university community, I'd like to thank the Lane family for their generosity in enabling us to bring powerful thought leaders like Dr. Treuer to our state. A few logistics: please be sure to keep your masks on throughout today's event. And after the talk, we'll be having a Q&A session over in the Center for Intercultural Learning and Affirmation, the CELA. And if you're watching live stream, please use the link in the YouTube description to submit your questions. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Rennie Christopher, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs here at the Vancouver campus.
Thank you very much. Wow, it is great to see people here in person today. I'm seeing some people who I have not seen in person for 2 years. Hi, y'all. And also, it's great to know that there are people at the remote locations as well. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. New York Times bestselling author David Treuer is Ojibwe from the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. The son of a Jewish Holocaust survivor and an Ojibwe lawyer and judge, Treuer grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation before attending Princeton, where he worked with Toni Morrison, and the University of Michigan, where he earned his PhD in anthropology. Treuer is the author of 7 books, 4 novels, and 3 works of nonfiction. He is the winner of 3 Minnesota Book Awards, the California Book Award for nonfiction, the Housatonic Book Award, and was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Carnegie Medal. His writing has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, The New York Times, LA Times, The Washington Post, among others. He divides his time between his home on the Leech Lake Reservation and Los Angeles, where he is a professor of English at the University of Southern California. To open our event, we will have a traditional welcome offered by Julian Ankney, who is Nimipu Nez Perce, residing on the Nez Perce Reservation in Lapwai, Idaho. She is a founding member of the Nimipu Lukupsime North Star Writers Collective. We are fortunate to have her teaching Native literature and creative writing, fiction and nonfiction, for us. Turning it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to take off my mask because it makes me sweaty. So I don't know if I need this. I'm just going to go like that. All right. Now I can't really see, so I'm just going to bend over like this. Oh, like this. All right. Tatalach oikalo inamunik tuas Julian Ankney. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Julian Ankney, and I reside on the Nez Perce Indian Reservation in Idaho. My ancestors are lean elk and pile of clouds. I am Nimipu, translated meaning the people, or my favorite translation, the real people. I'm a descendant from both colonizer and colonize. Tatala oikalo again, hello and good noontime. Kia eitzen was ask papine kina. We are happy that you are here today. Katsiao yao. Thank you. Today I'll be reading a land acknowledgement in the form of a poem. A poem to acknowledge the land itself, along with the people whose language, culture, and religion were born of it, is rarely acknowledged by one of my good friends and sister, Nimipu, or Native poet and author Seymour Furman. Let us pause for a moment and acknowledge the land on which we live. This is the traditional lands of the Chinook and Taitapam people and the Cowlitz Indian tribe, where Washington State University, Vancouver resides. We should take another moment to acknowledge the way Indigenous people have been and are being removed and erased from the land they've stewarded for over 16,000 years, swiftly, brutally, culturally, fatally. Let us acknowledge that the soldiers from the United States killed women and children because they were Native. Let us recognize and acknowledge the recentness of this. Let us acknowledge that Native people buried in their land without markers, while unnamed settlers rest in fenced graves. Let us acknowledge Indian graves dug up and looted. Let us acknowledge that place names like Custer National Forest, Squaw Meadow, and Dead Indian do not honor ancestors. Let us take a moment and acknowledge that this land was not stolen from the people whose language, culture, and religion were born of it. Let us acknowledge that the people were stolen from this land, the people who celebrate this land with song, dance, ceremony, people who do not commodify and commercialize trees and water and call it resource. Here, we pause to acknowledge the land itself is rarely acknowledged. The land buried beneath asphalt, cement, floorboards, and foundations. Let us acknowledge that this buried land, which once grew food and medicine, now grows dollar stores, subdivisions, and universities. Let us acknowledge that the land, the way subdividers do, with the blade of the bulldozer, with names like Forest Trail, Aspen Ridge, River Ranch, with words the way the government recognizes only federally recognized tribes and has taught some natives to recognize others only on paper, through blood quantum and certificate of Indian blood, instead of commitment to rights and sovereignty. Let us recognize land acknowledgements that serve as consolation, another checked box on a list called due diligence. The way wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt acknowledges white wokeness, while the same whites shop at white lives businesses. Acknowledgement as performative allyship. Let us acknowledge that internment camps were prisons. This land acknowledgement was written for the people whose acknowledge land in the way spotted knapweed acknowledges it, the way a for sale sign acknowledges it, the way Forest Service members acknowledges land by stating hashtag it's all yours, but meaning hashtag it's not theirs. The statement acknowledges the land in the same way the media and FBI acknowledges over 5,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls by recognizing that one missing white woman for whom hundreds search and whose picture is present on all our screens, the way Native silhouettes are screened on paper to sell cigarettes. This land acknowledgement is linked on the hard wood of a pine that escaped the fires but fell for the mill from the land that cannot help but acknowledge climate crisis and carrying capacities, the grizzly bear fatally removed, and the salmon who can no longer reach their original homelands. This land acknowledgement acknowledges the wolves shot by stockmen and sportsmen to preserve the animals stockmen and sportsmen will thenceforth kill in the name of husbandry and sport. Let us acknowledge how we honor loss with dollar signs and not grief. Let us make depredation a science and pay officers from the bank of conservation. Let us acknowledge the words used to dissociate: kill, killer, killing, killed. from the act of execution. This land acknowledges that it is recognized for its monetary value, recreational value, and aesthetic value, because it too is living. This land recognizes us by our carbon footprint, by our clear cuts, our gold mines, and our greed. This acknowledgement acknowledges that land back means language back, means medicine back, means ceremony back, means culture back, means reparations, means all people depend on the land. Let us acknowledge that unless action is taken to identify and empower Indigenous people, erase inaccurate histories from every school curriculum, carry out land-based justice and climate change policy, a land acknowledgement is a perfunctory, alienating, and otherwise hollow gesture. Acknowledgement means acceptance, admittance. Acknowledgement is a dead word. It is not a verb, is not deed, does mean education. Acknowledgement means too late for an apology. Read me your declaration of change, detail your plan of procedure, show me your map to equity, and then, just maybe then, I might be convinced that your land acknowledgement is not just another broken treaty. Yoh kulo. That is all. Again, Katiaya Oikolo, thank you everyone. We are now pleased and honored, and I have a gift for you too, to have here with us today, David Treuer. Katiaya. And these are beaded necklaces from my friend Feather Holt. Katiaya, David.
Put these right here. It's always dicey, folks. It's always with some nervousness that one has to give a talk, which will lack all of the power of the introduction. So like the best thing just happened. And I'm here to do the second best thing, which is to spend some time with you and to talk with you and to share some thoughts with you. So thanks for being here. It's great to see the diversity of masks in this room. And, thank you for being here. It's a weird time we live in, these COVID times. And I'm just happy to be back in this part of the world. So I was thinking a lot about what I was going to talk about and how I was going to talk about it with you. Hold on, I'm doing a tech thing. There we go. Wait, no, that's not working. 1 second. Anyway, I was going to read you a quote from Thomas Jefferson to start things off. I got to read it, though. It's really good. Hold that thought. There we go. And then I'll return to it in a little bit. Let's see. So Thomas Jefferson, while he was foreign minister in France, thought a lot about the new republic that they had just formed in the shape of the United States. And he said this, he said, quote, "I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as they are chiefly agricultural. And this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America," end quote. It's problematic, right? There were no vacant lands in North America. Around the same time, actually, a little bit later when he was president, he exchanged a bunch of secret memos with William Henry Harrison in 1803. And in which he sort of detailed how he was going to come into the possession of more vacant lands. He wrote, his good buddy, in a series of secret memos, he wrote this: to promote this disposition to exchange lands, which they, native people, have to spare and we want for necessities, which we have to spare and they want, we shall push our trading houses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among the tribes run into debt. Because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop off those debts by a cession of lands. In this way, our settlements will gradually circumscribe and approach the Indians, and they will in time either incorporate with us as citizens or remove beyond the Mississippi. The former is certainly the termination of their history, most happy for themselves. But in the whole course of this, it is essential to cultivate their love. As to their fear, we presume that our strength and their weakness is now so visible that they must see what we have only to shut our hands to crush them, and that all our liberalities to them proceed from our motives of pure humanity only. Should any tribe be foolhardy enough to take up the hatchet at any time, the seizing of the whole country of that tribe and driving them across the Mississippi as the only condition of peace would be an example to others and a furtherance of our final consolidation. What a dig. So, in plain language, Jefferson and America generally understood itself to be a country that would flourish, and for democracy to be an institution and a philosophy that would flourish insofar as there was land on which to grow it. In order to achieve that, while at the same time, it's a very tough position that America put itself in, right? So it needed land, but it needed to get the land in a way that didn't compromise the very ideals upon which the country was founded. So they had to perform, this country, Jefferson and others in the country itself, had to perform a series of mental tricks. How to take without seeming like we're taking. Otherwise, the contradictions are just too impossible to overcome, you know? So there were a couple ways in which this happened. One was to persist in thinking that Native people were just sort of happy wanderers, you know, with no fixed address, who weren't using or improving the land. That idea of husbandry, right? Of improving land, clearing it, planting it, improving it for agriculture. So they persisted in one idea that we just didn't do that. That's just not how we rolled. Native people didn't make use of the gifts that God had put in this good earth. So since we missed our shot, well, they should have it. Colonizers, right? Makes sense. Even though, right? Even though, as sort of early as the 16th century, so the 1500s, there was not a single tribe east of the Mississippi that was not predominantly and principally agricultural. Every tribe east of the Mississippi was, for the most part, sedentary, village-based, and agricultural. We were doing the exact things that Jefferson wanted his colonists to do, and we were doing it hundreds of years before America became a thing, you know? The other thing that, the other mental trick, so that's one mental trick, the other mental trick that people performed, and this is still being performed, by the way, is they were able to convince themselves that we just weren't even here. You know? That the story of the American Indian is one in which we have great futures behind us. and that too bad, so sad, we just all died off. This is a pernicious idea, right? And I cannot tell you how many times in my little life, and it's my birthday today, so wish me a happy birthday. Thank you. My increasingly long-lived life, you know, and this has happened to my brothers and my sisters. This happens to every Native person I know at one point or another. And I was like, well, you know, I'm Native. And they're like, well, that can't be. I'm like, why can't that be? He's like, I've heard this to my face. Like, well, because we killed you all. I'm like, I mean, okay, I can see why they would think that when they talk to me, because I don't look the way people want their Native people to look, you know? But I'm here to tell you that at least at Leech Lake, where I'm from, you know, we come in every shape and size and color and shade and all that stuff. But not all of us look like Jason Statham or like a Hollywood action hero like me. Not everyone is as blessed. But my older brother looks like, you know, a bona fide Hollywood Indian dude. You know, he's got dark skin and black hair. It's long. He's got a braid. You know, he teases me that I shave my head. And I'm like, hey, at least I don't do a braid over, okay? You know what I'm talking about. You know, like pretty soon you'll have a bolo tie and a Pendleton vest and you look like a tribal chairman, you know? But anyway, so he like, you know, he looks like the way people like their Native people to look. You know, and he says, well, I'm Native, you know, I'm Ojibwe from Leech Lake. And they're like, well, that can't be. You know, that can't be. We killed all of you. And then, so that's the second sort of mental trick. There's a third one, right? And I haven't spent too much time writing about this. I haven't spent too much time thinking about it, but I've spent a lot of time complaining about it. And that is that, you know, that we are sort of, that one, so the first mental trick is that, you know, we're not using the land. The second is that we're gone. The third is that, you know, we don't really believe in ownership of anything. So I'm here to dispel all three myths. And that one is a really, really deeply damaging one, promoted by a lot of well-meaning, liberal-minded folk, as much as by anyone else, right? Still pretty, you know, self-serving of the settler mindset, though. Like, well, you know, Native people believe that you can't, like, how can you own the air? How can you own the mountains? You know, that's just so beautiful. And it's just not true. It's not, we had all sorts of diverse ideas about ownership that predate the arrival of Westerners on these shores. Different, culturally scripted, but we had very firm ideas about ownership. To the point, like, oh, I love this guy. He's one of our chiefs, and he was kind of a jerk, not a nice guy, back in the day. And at one point, the government was trying to get my tribe to stop fighting our neighbors, the Lakota and Dakota, because we were in the process of expelling them from what's now Minnesota and Wisconsin. We were successful for the most part. And that's how the Lakota became a plains tribe. They were a woodland tribe at one point, and they were booted west by us, you know? But the US government was trying to get us to stop fighting, not for any altruistic reasons, but because warfare plays hell with trade. It's very hard to sell your shit, you know, if you could die doing it. So they wanted us to stop fighting so they could make money. So there's a big treaty at Prairie du Chien, I think 1824. I don't have my Google implanted. My 5G chip is already implanted, but it's not fully functioning. So like I can't access that right now, but around that time. And this Ojibwe chief by the name of Buganagijik, which means hole in the sky or hole in the day, he was awesome. And he said, yeah, we'll sign a treaty. Well, this is a little bit later, actually. This is in the 1840s. Like, we'll sign a treaty with you guys. Like, we'll stop fighting. He's like, but one of our conditions is that you have to move all of the ho-chunk another tribe in Wisconsin. You got to move them kind of in between us. We want you to relocate them, and put them kind of along the Red River as a kind of buffer state between us and the Lakota. Not a nice move, Not a kind neighborly thing for my tribe to do. And the government was like, well, what right? Who gives you the right to? I mean, the irony, right? The irony. We're like, what gives you the right to think that you can sort of, just dictate the future of some whole tribe and move them to some place? Which is funny, right? And Chief Bugganagishik's like, what right do we have? We have the same right that you have, like by right of conquest. We conquered the Ho-Chunk, we conquered the Lakota. We're the masters of this area. We own these lands. And so move them. So the government agreed to do it. They never did. Well, the Ho-Chunk got moved a lot, but not for that reason. They never fulfilled that provision of the treaty. It's probably good that one provision was broken, because now, it's just not nice, But we're not necessarily nice. But the point is that different tribes have long had very, very well-developed ideas about ownership, different than European ideas, for sure. But that's the third thing. That's this third fantasy, which facilitates, well, if they don't even really think they own anything, then if we take it, we're not really stealing, because it's not really theirs, All of these are very self-serving ideas, And I want to talk a little bit about the second one in some kind of depth, the idea of our disappearance. I remember so clearly being, and even though I'm super old, I get it, but when I was your age, when I was college age, and I was a sophomore in college, and I read Dee Brown's famous book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was kind of a rallying cry for the countercultural movement, which sprang up in the late 60s and in the 70s, which mobilized a lot of ideas about Native people, some false, most of them flattering. I remember reading that when I was a sophomore, as it so happened on the 100th anniversary of the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek in 1890. So I read the book in 1990 when I was a college sophomore. And I was far from home, super homesick for my homelands, for my family, my cousins, grandparents, And so I opened that book, and on the very first page, Dee Brown, and it's a really well-meaning book. And by the way, it is the best-selling book of Native history ever published to this day. So I subsequently wrote my book, and I'm really hoping that I sort of overtake him and put that book in its proper grave. But on the very first page of that book, so yeah, it's never been out of print. By the way, it was born the same year I was born. It was born in 1970, that book. It's a great year. On the very first page of that book, he says something to the effect of, I'm going to paraphrase for a little bit. He says, my book is about the Plains Wars in the American West, a time of unparalleled greed and violence and cries for freedom made at the expense of those, cries for freedom made by those who already possess it at the expense of those who don't. It's pretty good, right? I start in 1850 at the beginnings of the Plains Wars, and I end in 1890 at the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek, where, and I'm going to quote, the culture and civilization of the American Indian was finally destroyed, end quote. And so if you happen, and on the next page, he says, so if you happen to travel to a contemporary Indian reservation and notice the poverty and the hopelessness and the squalor, perhaps by reading my book, you will begin to understand why. And I'm just like, fuck you, man. I was so upset, Dee Brown, I never got to meet the guy. I'm sure he was a super nice dude, and he was doing his best, And it was a book about us, and about our history, and for that I was very grateful. But I didn't feel like my culture was destroyed. My civilization wasn't gone, you know? And my reservation wasn't merely a place where hope goes to die, you know? It was a vital, complicated, interesting, important place, my reservation, you know? I found that very offensive, you know? And it so neatly fits into, as I began this little talk, it so neatly fits into these preconceived ideas, these very self-serving ideas. We don't own anything, you know, we're all gone, and so on. It supported those ideas despite its liberality and despite its compassion, you know? How convenient it would be if we were gone. So that stuck with me, that really stuck with me. From 1990, you know, until more recently when, you know, I'm like, I want to address that, you know? But I had my own, you know, problems, right? Just because I'm Native doesn't mean I'm immune to sort of the virus of influence. You know, just because I'm Native does not mean that I'm not affected by and in many ways shaped by the stories that America tells about itself to itself. And that I, you know, I've learned to accept and see those things as true or reasonable, you know? And so I knew instinctively, that he couldn't possibly be true because my very presence in this world and the presence of my community, my family, refute the things he said in the beginning of that book. On the other hand, I couldn't see what else was out there, you know? And so I wrote The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee as kind of a quest, you know? A fairly open-ended quest to look at sort of, if we didn't all die in 1890, you know, but 1890 is such an important, it's such a watershed year. The last major armed conflict between tribes and the federal government, unless you count like Wounded Knee 2, the American Indian movement. I don't count that, but some people do. Last major armed military conflict between tribes and the federal government. The year that the government declared the West settled, manifest destiny, done manifested, and the frontier closed. 1890, the population of Native American people in this country was roughly 200,000, down from, estimates vary, between 5 and 30 million at the time of first contact. And also, I'd like to posit a sidebar. Most of us didn't die of disease. That's the story that we're all told. That's another story. Again, self-serving, like, oh, you know, too bad, so sad. But, you know, Native American folk just didn't have immunity against, you know, smallpox and the flu and the common cold. And that's sad. That's just, it's not really anyone's fault. It's just sad, you know? But you know who didn't have immunity against the Black Plague? Europeans. You know how many Europeans died in the Black Plague? And, you know, it wasn't just one event, it was kind of a series, kind of like COVID right now, right? It's kind of a series of waves, right? You know, we're learning how these plagues work. We're living in one. They lost between 50 and 75% of the population of Europe. But Europeans had access to, at that time, food, shelter. They were able to rebound from that. It took, you know, I don't know, I'm not a demographer, and I'm not a scientist of the plague, but it took some decades, you know, population recovered. Our populations didn't recover because we were being displaced, starved, and enslaved. Crowded into sort of small areas, overcrowded, underfed. And so our populations didn't recover. Until, why is 1917 such an important year? It's a really important year, guys. You should know this. It was the first time since 1492 that native births outstripped native deaths. So it took a while, right? It took some time. But more native folk were being born than were dying. And that is a trend that has continued. And it's like now we're like really good at having sex and not dying, right? Like superpowers. You heard it here, folks. You know, I heard this guy come speak at WSU, and like he was a finalist for the National Book Award, and he says like Indians are really good at sex, so it must be true. No. Don't quote me, okay? I'm just being funny. So now, and people just have a hard time with this, right? A hard time just accepting this to be true. Not this last thing, but the next thing. The next thing I want to tell you is that as of the most recent census, there are nearly 6 million Native people in the United States. There are more Native people than there are people who identify as Jewish American, not that you would ever know that from the media. There are twice as many Native people in the United States than there are those who identify as Muslim American, not that you would ever know that. You know? We are not just still here, we are back with force. Right? Anyway, so keep those numbers in your heads and keep those dates in your heads, right? They're important. 1492, 1890, 1917, 2020, you know? So I felt like after Dee Brown's book that I wanted to explore like, well, what if we're not all dead, what have we been doing? You know? What have we been up to? And I knew that we've been up to more than simply suffering. You know? And that Native communities, either reservations or urban communities or wherever we are more than just a collections of sorrow. And I knew that our history was more than just a laundry list of abuse that we had suffered at the hands of various governments and historical processes, right? More than that. There was another book I read at the same time that I read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee when I was a college student. Super boring book by Karl Marx called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Right? You know this? Super boring. I'm not wrong. Yeah. It's really bad. I mean, it's not bad, but, and Karl Marx is actually, like, for those of you who haven't read Marx, like, he's a witty dude. He's a fun writer. Long-winded, but fun. Trust me, you know? And in the 18th Brumaire, which is actually kind of boring, in the very first paragraph, though, he says something really that stuck with me. And what he said, I don't think I got past the first paragraph that first time around, but it was a great first paragraph, though. And he said, all men make history. They just don't always make it with tools of their choosing or as they please, but they make history nonetheless. And his point was, you know, like, even the most disempowered, he, of course, was phenomenally obsessed with the idea of class, of course, are historical actors and make history, not always as they choose, not with tools of their fashioning, but they make it regardless. And that seemed to me to be a really good guiding principle for the book that I wanted to write. So I set off on an endeavor, on a quest. I was going to write a follow-up and a counter-narrative to Dee Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I was going to start in 1890, and I was going to bring the story of Native America and the Native American, no such thing, right? But still, up to the present with the opposite thesis in tow, that 1890 wasn't the end. It was a low point, to be sure. Between 1890 and 1900, I think we were at our weakest, generally speaking. We were the most politically disenfranchised that our tribal nations had ever been. Our children were being taken from us in great numbers and sent to residential boarding schools, which is in the news a lot lately. Our land was disappearing under our feet after the passage of the General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act, passed in 1886 or 87. I can never remember which year, but one of those two. Our numbers were at the lowest they had ever been. Those were dark years. Those were tough years. Our religions were effectively outlawed and suppressed. And by the way, Native American religion wasn't legal in this country, so founded on the idea of, religious freedom. In what year were Native religions finally made legal by congressional act? Any idea? 78. 1978. It finally became legal to practice our religions. I mean, those laws hadn't been enforced for some time, but they were still on the books, So 1890 was rough, but it's a point from which we have been emerging and making history, not always with tools of our choosing, not always from positions of power, but we've been making history nonetheless, And I want to sort of throw a bunch of it's almost like it's either spoken word or it's a listicle, depending on my delivery. But I want to throw some information at you. And by the way, I need to mind the clock. Where are we at? 15 minutes? Okay, and then we open it up for questions, right? At that point? Excellent, okay, great. Honestly, questions are the best part. Because, another sidebar, being a writer is really largely a matter of sitting in a room by yourself making stuff up, if you're writing fiction. And then, only halfway making stuff up if you write nonfiction. But in both cases, it's a pretty solitary endeavor. And it's really nice to sort of be let out of the pen, get a little free-range writer on your hands, and you can wander about, and get exercise and talk to people. So I really do enjoy the Q&A. I do enjoy the back and forth, mostly. Sometimes you get crazy questions. I don't want to embargo anyone's questions, but sometimes you get nutty questions. It's so funny. But I do want to say there's a tendency, right? There's a tendency to tune into Native lives or Native stories, usually only in November. It's Native American History Month. It's Thanksgiving, right? And usually only as a kind of liberal social act. Oh God, I feel so bad. What's happened to the Indian? I'm gonna read this book by Tommy Orange. It's a good book, you should read it, but and then that as though sort of tuning in temporarily and picking up a book is the same thing as a political act or as political change. And it's not, right? People tune in and they encourage, right? They encourage the stories of native loss. Is a story that sort of non-natives love to hear, and frankly, Native people love to tell. There's a market for that story. Stories of Native loss, stories of tribes with great futures behind us rather than in front, serve the status quo. And people gobble them up because they feel this intense emotion. The story of Native people is so often a story of tragedy. That's the story that people tell. The tragic narrative is really the dominant, if not the only narrative mode used to tell Native stories. Tragedy, as Aristotle reminds us going way back, is a drama posed in such a way as to, and I'm quoting Aristotle, you should be really impressed I can do this from memory, right? Is a story posed in such a way as to elicit the twin feelings of pity and fear, which lead to a catharsis. That's the emotional game that you play when you partake in either reading or watching a tragedy. That's what happens when you watch Macbeth. You're like, no. Pity, fear, catharsis, a release of emotion. People love that narrative mode to tell the story of the Indian because it doesn't change a damn thing. And you think deep feeling is the same as political action. You think deep feeling is the same thing as engagement. You think deep feeling is the same thing as change, and it's not. Absolutely not. And, but that's, people love a story of Native loss. And so they tune in for the catharsis. They tune in as a kind of liberal social act, like, to read a book or to go see a show or to come to a lecture like this, in the manner of volunteering in an after-school program. I've done a good thing. But I don't think that's the right reason. I mean, at least not entirely, to tune into Native lives, Native stories, Native history, at all. So I actually think that you cannot understand this country. You cannot understand its past. You cannot understand its current practices. You can't understand where it's going unless you know something and you think about Native American lives, past and present. You simply can't. We are not a sideshow. We are not, what's on the menu in only November. We're vital to this country. This country has grown up from the very beginning in relation to us. The Boston Tea Party, they dumped tea in Boston Harbor. You all learned that in school, but what else don't they really linger on too much about the Boston Tea Party? That's right. The colonists dressed up not just as generic Indians, they dressed up as Mohawk Indians to protest how they were being treated by the British. Like, you're doing to us what we're doing to them. One of the main reasons, which is elided from a lot of our storytelling about that revolution, one of the main reasons why the colonists went to war with the British was not merely over taxation without representation. That was an issue. A bigger issue was who got to make money off of expropriating Indian lands to the west of the 13 colonies? Would the crown get that money? Or would the colonists get that money? Who would get to steal from us? That was one of the main reasons we went to war with Britain. So the whole Revolutionary War, we were implicated in that. Our lands, if we want to return to environmental ideas and concerns, right? Our lands were central to that conflict. The first treaty that America signed before this country was even a country, was with the Delaware. Because the United States, the colonists wanted the Delaware to protect the western frontier of the colonies from the British so that they wouldn't do an end around the Treaty of Fort Pitt. One of the provisions of that treaty was that there were many provisions, but that we would help them, the mutual aid, that they could build forts, that that they would sell the Delaware stuff and all sorts of stuff. But one of the other main provisions was that after the Revolution, the Delaware Nation would be incorporated into the United States as the 14th state with representation in Congress. That didn't happen yet. Why can't it happen now? Why shouldn't it? But moving on, hey, the colonists won, and as they are trying to put their heads together and figure out what kind of government do we want to have that's never before been seen on Earth, to whom did they turn? Right? Again, to the Mohawk, and by extension, the Iroquois Confederacy. It's on the Iroquois Confederacy that our separation of powers is modeled. Judicial, legislative, executive. Our American government has Native character. American government is Indian government. Moving forward in time, the first, we're taught that, the Civil War and the issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery was really the first test of states' rights versus federal power, which is a complicated relationship ongoing today. ergo Texas in the abortion ban, But that's not true. The first test of states' rights versus federal power was not a two-way power struggle. It was a three-way power struggle between the federal government, the states, and native tribes in the American Southeast with the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. That was the first test, And again, if you want to talk about land, why did they want to remove the 5 civilized tribes from the American Southeast? It wasn't because of gold. There was a little bit of gold in Cherokee country, but not that much. Slavery. They needed land to expand the institution of slavery in the South. And if you don't believe me, after the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and by the time that all of the native people in what's now the state of Alabama had been moved to Indian Territory, in those 10 years, 1830 to 1840, all Indian lands in the state of Alabama were lost, were expropriated. And in that time, the number of enslaved people in the state of Alabama expanded by a factor of 10 because they had new lands on which to work to death enslaved people. You can't understand American history without knowing Native history. You can't understand the American landscape and American land without knowing Native history. Even more recently, between 1965 and 1995, the United States Supreme Court heard more cases about federal Indian law than any other genre of law. More than immigration, more than reproductive rights, more than women's rights, more than civil rights, more than banking, more than, Second Amendment. As America was trying to rethink itself and recast its character during and after civil rights, Vietnam War, Pentagon Papers, Watergate, at least at the level of the Supreme Court, it was doing so in considering the collective rights of tribal nations. America doesn't come into focus without thinking about us. Even more recently, the pipeline protest at Standing Rock, North Dakota, was framed by the former tribal chairman, David Archambault III, a leader I really respect, but I really disagreed with him in how he framed this conflict. He said, this is another instance of cowboys versus Indians. They wanted to build this pipeline not across the reservation, but across sort of Missouri River, under it, That's not what the conflict was, in my opinion. The conflict that we saw at Standing Rock, and that we are still seeing during Line 3 protests in Minnesota going on right now, very violent ones, it doesn't get as much coverage as Standing Rock. What we saw was a conflict between corporate greed on one hand and the common good on the other. But it was a fight that Native people were fighting on behalf of all Americans and frankly, all citizens of the world, as we think about our reliance on fossil fuels and their transportation and the environmental degradation that is a part of that process. So it wasn't just the white man keeping the Indian down in that case, it was the Native who was pushing a fight on behalf of so many people, into public consciousness. So you can't understand the past, you can't understand the present without considering Native lives. This is true for big historical movements. This is true for thinking about sort of, all these divisions which are increasingly complicated between what we mean when we say nature and what we mean when we say urban and what we think of as quote unquote wild and what we think of as a place that's been unwilded, This is really the purview of people who work in environmental studies. That's not me. So there are far more knowledgeable people, than I to speak to that. So with that, I think my time is up-ish. Well, tell me the truth. Like what? 5 more minutes? You probably also heard, I'm going to use all the time you're going to let me have. You've probably also heard, that Native people that were natural environmentalists, that, were like really close with nature, I kind of think of it as my sort of civic duty to disagree with everybody all the time, I mean, there was a French poet, Mallarmé, who said something to the effect of, if he praises himself, I humble him. If he humbles himself, I praise him until he comprehends that he's an incomprehensible monster. And that's really my mantra, So yeah, I'm sure you've heard that, we're nature, man. We're so close to it. Like, life is a circle. We're circular, I mean, okay, maybe, kind of, but I like to argue against that idea sometimes, And I'll be like, when someone says it, I'm like, well, what about Plains tribes before they had horses and guns, and they would just stampede like thousands of bison off of cliffs, and they don't have refrigerators, so like they just take the tongues and the humps and they move on, and they all rotted. Archaeological record tells us this is true. It is true. We didn't use all the parts of the bison, It wasn't feasible before refrigeration to always get every part, and to be able to use it before it goes bad. Just, I don't know if you've been to the Southwest and you see those beautiful, like, Chaco Canyon and, Palos Verdes, all these like beautiful sort of cliff palaces, these Anasazi cultures. Totally, they had societal collapse because they over-irrigated and thus over-salinated huge tracts of once fertile land in the American Southwest. It became unfarmable because of their aggressive farming practices. They scattered, they regrouped, they became Pueblo people, and disappear. It's not like, where did they go? It's not like Atlantis or anything, but like, we have made mistakes. The American beaver was extinct east of the Mississippi until well toward the end of the 19th century from overtrapping. Who did that? We did. My tribe. Like, we're really good trappers. Like, there's money to be made. So like, I like to push against this idea of a natural, uncomplicated relationship between Native people and our homelands, right? It's complicated. It's imperfect. We're not always great, but like, it's important to me to sort of remember these kinds of things, right? To not simply sort of reduce and essentialize either my culture or my culture's history in order to sort of be some sort of perfect alternative to Western society. We are as enmeshed in, global capitalism and exploitation as anybody else, Who's the number one coal producer in the American Southwest? I think the Navajo Nation. Yeah? Who's the most aggressive miners of uranium in the American Southwest? I think also Navajo Nation giving mining leases, It's more complicated, right? We are not simply, a kind of compact and shiny alternative to Western aggression and Western exploitation. That division is, I think, is a false division, and it's not very helpful. As we all try to sort of put our heads together and solve all sorts of environmental problems, That said, we've had some good ideas and better than some over time. Do you know you can see the Menominee Nation from space? Want to know why? It's green. It's a green rectangle, in east central Wisconsin, because they have for centuries practiced a sustainable forestry approach that has preserved their forest and provided them with millions of board feet of lumber every year they can sell. You know? And you look at satellite photos and you can see the Menominee Nation, and then the rest around it is just brown because it's all farmland now. All the trees are gone, logged off, pulled up, plowed under, you know? So, although we're not always a great in sort of, it's not we're not an easy alternative to sort of, you know, Western aggression. On the other hand, you know, different tribes at different times have had some phenomenally interesting ideas and approaches to sustainable living, if that's something that you're concerned with. Menominees are so cool, you know? I mean, so many centuries, you know, ahead the curve. You know, they could be learned from. Anyway, I like to complicate things. And with that, it's time for questions. Thank you so much. Oh, you're going to field from?
Well, I just want to say one thing as we transition to the Q&A period. I want to remind our online audience that you could submit questions via the link in the YouTube description. And for the live audience, we ask that you raise your hand, and Julian's going to help us find your questions, and I'm going to be collecting the questions from the online audience.
Okay, cool.
And reading those off.
Yeah, so like instead of passing like a dirty microphone around the room, so what we can do is you can just ask your question, and then I'll repeat it, and then it'll be mic'd and streamed so that people elsewhere can hear the question. So just raise your hand, and then I'll repeat. And if I don't like it, I'll just change the question a little bit, and then people, like the satellite audiences, won't even know. You know, they'll have no idea. But I'm really, seriously, I love questions, so please, let's go. Let's do this. Yeah, back. Yeah, I made a modest suggestion recently in the Atlantic Monthly that all of America's national parks should be returned to Native tribes to manage on behalf of all Americans and international park visitors. You know, and I got interviewed a lot about the piece, and someone's like, some of the interviews like, you know, this is very, it's a very bold idea. Now I'm like, you know, it's a bold idea. I don't think it's bold at all. I think it's sensible. I think a bold idea is to like steal a bunch of shit and then ruin it. I think that's bold. You know, that's a bold idea. I'm suggesting a very modest solution to a problem. But you're right to point out, like, you know, different European countries paid reparations to people who, you know, to the descendants of people who suffered in the Holocaust. They can't exactly pay to people who died in the Holocaust. My father, who was a Holocaust survivor, got a very modest, small, I mean, like a couple $100s a month pension from the Austrian government until he died. Didn't quite make up for everything, you know. There have been a lot of discussions about reparations for the descendants of enslaved people in the United States. And I think that's something worth considering. No one has really seriously talked about reparations, you know, regarding Native people and Native tribes. It would be vastly more complicated, probably, because we're so more vastly scattered, and the processes by which we, you know, we suffered were so much more complex and lasted so much longer. And we're not uniform everywhere, you know? I think a good start, you know, a very basic start would be to restore and reinforce and strengthen the existing treaty provisions that the United States government is still not recognizing. That would be a start, you know? Another start would be, this doesn't quite affect my tribe in the same way. Certain bands of my tribe were relocated by force at certain times, but it wasn't really, there were so many of us, and we were so widely scattered that even my tribe, there's a diversity of historical experiences, right? But I think also particularly the tribes that were forcibly relocated off of their homelands,
I think that would be an excellent place to start. I'm thinking of tribes from the Southeast. I'm thinking of the Ho-Chunk. I'm thinking of Nez Perce. I'm thinking of tribes like that, you know. Those would be pretty compact and simple and probably easy to get our minds around if you wanted to start thinking about reparations, you know. I always say, and I'm not even joking, I don't think any Native person should ever have to pay for parking in this country.
I pay for parking.
Right? Ever. It just, you know how offensive it is to have to pay for parking on Native land?
So offensive.
It's so offensive. I'm only half joking, you know? And we should get there should be places reserved at the, right in front of the doors of Walmart for us. You know? You know what I mean, you know? Now I'm joking, but I don't think anyone should shop at Walmart, but I know it's a necessity for a lot of people, right? Anyway, there's a discussion to be had, you know? There's currently sort of gathering energy and attention being paid to boarding schools and the lives lost at boarding schools, right? You know? Nothing can be done except maybe some repatriation, perhaps, where the remains of Native children who were taken and then died at boarding school and then were buried there. And that's painful and that's sad, but that's in many ways symbolic. I think that education at all levels, this is a form of reparations for the historical trauma and dislocations and this terrible side effects of boarding schools. All education at all levels should be free for any Native person or descendant of Native person, not just federally recognized Native people, you know? That should be done. I don't care where. You want to go to Choate, you want to go to some fancy ass, private school on the East Coast, that should be free, you know? You want to go to community college, that should be free. You want to go to WSU, that should be free. Considering what we lost in that initial educational process, that wouldn't be that hard. It'd be expensive, but don't do the crime if you don't want to do the time, as they say. Next question.
Connecting to the topic of reparations, I would love to get your opinion on whether you think there would be any value to changing the names of locations and institutions that were named after these genocidal presidents.
Yeah.
To reflect what the Native people would have called that.
Yeah. The question is vis-a-vis reparations, how do I feel about the idea of changing place names and monument names or streets or whatever it might be, back to sort of native names or place names, or at least away from truly dastardly, awful people, And I think that's a great idea, And it's a super tradish idea. So for Ojibwe people, when you're named, right? When you get your name, and you'll be given a name, sometimes people do it later in life, but usually it happens around birth. You're pretty young, and you have a namesake. Niyawe'e in Ojibwe means my namesake. Niyao, it's an interesting word etymologically. Niyao means my being, my soul, I guess. We don't really have a soul word, but I guess that's the closest we would have. Niyawe'e means my soul sharer. And the idea is when someone gives you a name, they're kind of excising a little piece of themselves, giving it to you, the person being named. And that little person being named is giving a little piece of themselves back to the person who's giving the name. And so you have this bond with your namesakes, which is really profound and it's lifelong, And my niece was at a ceremony with my brother, and she was young, I don't know, 7 or 8. And she saw this guy sitting behind them at the drum dance. And my brother knew him really well. His name was Melvin Eagle. She was like, "Hey, Owe'e, hi, Owe'e." And my brother's like, "He's not your Owe'e." She's like, "Yeah, he is. He's my Owe'e." He's like, "No, he's not." Because he wasn't one of her namesakes. And Melvin was a pretty old guy. And he pulled my brother aside and he's like, she's calling me namesake. So that means that I should be. So let's do that. Let's have a ceremony, you know? And so like, why can't places be the same? Why can't we rename them, right? And it's kind of, there's a kind of reciprocity, right? So yeah, I think we should rename a bunch of shit, you know? And in and of itself, that is a kind of, yes, it's symbolic. There's a lake called Lake Calhoun in Minneapolis that was renamed, and it's a Dakota name. And I honestly cannot remember what it is because I'm not Dakota, and I'm really rude that way. And it got renamed its original Dakota name, and some people were up in arms. I'm like, but no, this is a healthy, good thing, you know? It's kind of like creating this reciprocal sort of namesake relationship with the place. That's kind of cool. It's also symbolic, and symbolism is important. So just because something is symbolic doesn't mean it's meaningless, you know? So yeah, I think it's great, you know? Why not? I think it could be really healthy, really good. Good question. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's right. Right. Dang. Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, that is a great question. I'll see if I can rephrase it for the remote audience as well as you put it. But the question was, there are over 575 federally recognized tribes, and so as many governments, if not more. And increasingly in this day and age where there's a lot more consultation on the state and federal level with tribes, like what is the best way to make, that's just so many government, that's just so much government, you know? And so it's cumbersome and it's complicated, and you know, you feel like you get stuck practically in administrative limbo, I think, a lot of times. And it's hard to see or measure progress. How to make that, the question is, do I have any ideas on how to make that better? And if I did, man, I'd be in charge of everything. That's so hard, you know? That's such a hard question to answer. But like, yeah, I don't have, you know, shouldn't there be a silver bullet for this, right? It is a conundrum. I mean, the only real answer I have is I think the time has come to put me in charge of everything. And by everything, I mean like everything. Because that would be the simplest process, right? Because then I would be the federal government, I would be all the state governments, I'd be all the tribal governments, and I could just, you know, just a terrible idea. No one should ever put me in charge of anything. Things would be really bad if that happened, honestly. I don't know. Actually, I really don't. But I will say that there's kind of a knowledge gap out there, you know, which is kind of the fault of our educational structure. Now, you know, we all can feel what's happening now, right? What's happening now is conservative think tanks are trying to sort of screw up, you know, the chance of Democrats being reelected by pinning this idea of critical race theory on us in the way that sort of the conservative establishment has always tried to sort of paint us in a sort of, you know, with a brush that makes it very hard for us to sound legible to people who aren't academics, and super liberal snowflakes, right? What the most recent, they've tried this with capital punishment back in the 80s, abortion during that time, a little bit before that. They pin an unwinnable issue on liberal folk. They're doing that with the critical race theory now. So that said, in a state like Oregon or Washington or Idaho or Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, parts of Kansas, lots of Oklahoma, big parts of Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, California, you get the point. And in lots of these places, no matter who you are, you're living in a place that is governed in many ways by not just federal power and state power and federal laws and state laws, but by tribal communities and tribal laws. Yet at no point in our educations anywhere that I've ever heard of, in 7th grade, when you start your first civics lesson, you learn about, well, there's the executive and the legislative and the judicial, and those are white and awesome. And this is how municipalities work, and in counties and townships and in civics, you learn how the structures of power work in this country, but you're never taught how structures of native power work in places where they directly affect you. No 7th grader is asked to read a treaty. No 8th grader, 9th grader, no one is required to read the treaties which shape these places to this day. No one is required to study tribal government. No Minnesota students there's the state and there's the federal power, then there's counties, and there's the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which is comprised of 6 of the 7 Ojibwe reservations in the state, governed by the Reservation Business Council, and they don't have to know that, but it affects them. So, that would be one place to start, is to start young, and then because there is a knowledge gap between how tribes work, and how they don't. And I think that would be incredibly helpful, There should be a boot camp for anyone who's in the government service, whose service touches in any way on Native issues. You're like, this is where you go. Harvard has a sort of institute for Indigenous or Native American governance, I think. There should be more. They have tribal liaisons, but who says that? Do they know what they're doing? Do they know how power works? I don't know. Have they been trained to liaise? Unlikely. Yeah. Oh yeah, let's hear those.
So one of the questions is, Indigenous people occupy a liminal space that accounts for both the political and racialized natures of our identities. Can you speak to how environmental justice also intersects with social justice for all people?
Holy moly, that is a really smart question.
I wrote that one, actually.
You wrote
one
that?
of my questions in there. That's
Okay. I don't know if I have a pithy answer for you. No, I'm serious. That's a really complicated question. So yes, in many ways, we occupy a liminal space. And by that, think about this. We're the most visible, invisible minority in this country. Right? So by that, I mean, we are immensely present in people's imaginations, past and present. We occupy a lot of American headspace, but we are rarely encountered, at least in ways that people recognize as a Native encounter, right? Because we're imagined gone, right? We started our talk about this. So there's a big disparity. We take up all this headspace, but we don't take up a lot of social space. And so there's this liminality which sort of affects us, here but not here, seen but invisible. And that's really complicated. And how does that work around issues of environmental justice? And how does that intersect with that? That is a big question. That is a dissertation question. Julian, come on. But it's huge. It is such a good question, because there's ways in which sort of, we are, as we began this talk, we are also unseen, purposely unseen, as tenants on the land, as people who are sort of on it and in it to this day. That's very strategic kind of invisibility foisted on us, oftentimes, right? Not an invisibility we choose. I don't have an answer. It's a conversation, that we need to have later today. Right?
Okay, now this is not my question.
Okay.
But in your recent Atlantic Monthly article, you observed that mainstream America has become more similar to Native Americans in the way that they view connections with the environment. Have you seen any examples where Native communities could offer new ideas or leadership for grappling with climate change?
Gosh. This could be because I'm ignorant. That's a caveat, My job is to know a bunch of things, but I can't know everything, which is why no one should put me in charge of everything, right? We already covered that. There have been vigorous sort of Native activists who are fighting hard against climate change. The activists who are fighting against Line 3 pipeline going through Minnesota right now. Winona LaDuke is a kind of famous environmental activist. But from where I sit and from what I see, and this is only from where I sit, and this is only about what I see, which is to say it's incredibly limited, incredibly shaped only by my experience. I have not seen the kind of Native leadership vis-a-vis climate change is not particularly different from other efforts to combat climate change. That in terms of what I've seen, the kind of the talking points and the kind of activism, which isn't to say it's negligible, it's really important, but the kinds of things LaDuke is saying is not that different from the things that Bill McKibben is saying, but there's probably a bunch of stuff I don't know, right? Honestly, I mean that honestly. It's not just, that's not just decoration. Yes. Yeah. Two parts. One, I push back against the rhetoric of rewilding as though sort of civilization is something over here and Native cultures are somehow outside of it and more natural or less, you know what I mean? There's a long history in environmental studies, but also in cultural studies of looking at the ways in which sort of natives were imagined as outside of civilization, beyond its margins, in the lands outside of it that we were on, we were of a piece, we were savage, the land was savage, we were untamed, the land was untamed, it was wild, we were wild, and civilization was slowly pushing against us all the time. So there's a long sort of history of that kind of rhetoric, which I would push back against. But the second part of your question, how have Native tribes been responding, in relation to COVID, I've been so impressed, honestly. I've been so proud of the kinds of actions that tribes have taken, I remember in the early days of COVID, this is in northern Minnesota, where, unless you're on a reservation, it's Trump country to a large degree, And I actually pulled up, because I've been joking about Walmart all day, I pulled up at Walmart. No, it was Target. I'm walking out of Target. No, wait, hold on. I got it. I'm painting a word picture. I was going into Menards. I don't know if you have Menards stores here, but it's basically like a regional Home Depot. it's where the hicks hang out, you know? And I get out of my car and I see this car pull up near me, door slams, and like these two guys from Red Lake get out of their car. And these Red Lakers, like, I don't know if you've ever met a Red Laker. Like, to most outsiders, these are big. I don't know why they're bigger there, but they just feel bigger to me, you know? Big, very dark, and like they're very sort of, I imagine like maybe to outsiders, like scary, like big tough dudes. They both got out of the pickup truck, which is a big tough truck, you know? They get out and they're walking toward Menards, and they both like reach in their pockets, like mask up, you know? No one's masking at this point in Minnesota, you know? I'm like, all right, you know, these guys are awesome. And it's been incredible, you know? A thing to study, a thing to look at is like also the Blackfeet during COVID. To access, like, I think some of the east and south entrances to Glacier National Park, you have to pass through Blackfeet Nation to get there, unless you're coming from the west. Some of you might know the geography a little better than I do, right? Because we're not terribly far from there, relatively speaking. The Blackfeet were really upset because there were a lot of people just kind of coming through Browning and coming through East Glacier, not masking up, these like lines of tourists. And they were concerned about their tribe. They were concerned about their elders, you know? So they asked, like, would you please, you know, blah, 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 blah. And then everyone's like, you know, forget those guys. So the Blackfeet are like, all right, we're going to close all of our roads, lead to the eastern side of the park. It's roadblocks. You can't pass through here. It's a sovereign nation, sovereign land. You can't come here. So, and like the National Park Service is very upset, and the state of Montana was very upset, and they're like, suck it. And so like, to get to Glacier, you had to go all the way around. They're like, we have to protect our people. And if you're not going to mask up and you're not going to protect us, we're going to protect ourselves. So I've been really like, so that's like an interesting, like environmental sort of, you know, like a little kind of pocket issue that would be fun to do a research paper on, if like you're in environmental studies. That'd be really interesting. You know, I think that was so cool. So I've been very impressed. You know, in a radical turnaround in many places, tribes were aggressively getting early shipments of the vaccine. And then once our tribal members were vaccinated, you know what we did? We opened it up to our neighbors. Like Leech Lake and White Earth and Red Lake, as it turns out in Minnesota, vaccinated a large portion of the northern part of the state. Like we took care of them too, you know, because they're our neighbors. We care about them. So I've been very, very impressed by tribes in COVID. Very impressed, you know. I mean, some places must be screwing it up, right? But I didn't really hear much of that. One last question. That's you. That's you. Go for it. Yeah. That's a really good question. The question was, what's your name? Anna? Anna. Dang it. I'm hard of hearing. Emma. The masks make it hard. Thank you. Emma asked about, I'm assuming my most recent book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, because there's 6 others too, you know, they get lonely. And sort of what the process was like as I went to was writing about Native history and so on. So I've got 2 books which are kind of about, I guess, Native life, right? One is called Res Life, which was my first big book of nonfiction. And I followed that up with The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. But I kind of developed I defaulted into a method with the first one, with Res Life, because it wasn't intentional. But I was struggling to write that book, and I wrote a whole draft, and it was rejected by my publisher. And they said I had to start over, or they were going to cancel my contract. Like, it was dire. It was really, and it was my first attempt at nonfiction, and I was really not good at it. I didn't know how to do it. And so like, once I started figuring it out, I'm like, oh, okay, this is a book about res life. It's not about death. It's about life. And so I had to talk to people, you know? I really have to talk to people. So I went out and I interviewed lots and lots of people for that book. And then by listening to them, so I did that, and I went back and I consulted the historical record too. So I consulted history books and articles and news and things like that. And then I involved myself, because the book was really very much about me trying to see the place that I was from differently, the reservation that I was from, trying to see it in some way that was better than the way I'd grown up thinking about the place I was from. So I handed that draft to my publisher, and they're like, yeah, this is pretty good, but we want you to take out all the stuff about yourself. I said, really? I'm like, yeah, can't do that. So you can cancel the book if you want to. I'm not doing that. He says, well, give me a justification. I'm like, look, I spent 3 years talking to people and asking them to share their lives with me and to put themselves on the line. And it feels incredibly rude not to risk something of myself. If I'm asking them to do a hard thing, I need to do the hard thing too, you know? And so the resulting book is sort of a melange of history, reportage, and memoir. But I was really interested, and I developed it with that first book, and then I think improved it in Heartbeat. And it was really important because I really think of history not as a set of dates and names and events in the past. That's not history to me. History is a force that flows through us and is expressed in our experiences, our thoughts, our behaviors, you know? And so when I talked to people, I would try to hear how history flowed through them. I was talking to this one guy, this Blackfeet guy, and I'll have to end after this. They're going to kick me out of here soon. But I didn't know any Blackfeet people, you know? I had some Facebook friends who were Blackfeet. So I emailed one on Messenger. I'm like, hey, I want to come up there and interview people for this new book, and blah, blah, blah. And I can come up there. Can you show me around? Can you introduce me to folks? He's like, yeah, I can do that. So I got there and I'm like, hey, where should I stay? He's like, our casino sucks, but you can stay with me and my family and my sister and her kids. I'm like, cool, you know, in that Indian way. And then, so I texted him when I got to Browning and I said, so where should I meet you? He's like, I'll meet you in the casino parking lot. I'm like, cool. He's like, yeah, I'm going to be there with 11 of my cousins. We're going to knock the shit out of you. And I was just like, oh God, I don't know if he's kidding or not, you know? So I texted him back. I'm like, you know what, Sterling? I'm like, you know, 11, 12 Blackfeet against one Ojibwe sounds like even odds. Bring your cousins, I don't give a shit. And he's like, this is gonna be so much fun. And I'm like, oh, but this is not a very precise word, like this. Does he mean like, because I can tease back, or does this mean a fight? I didn't know. And it was just him, you know, he was kidding. And he introduced me to all these people. And one of these guys, his name was Red Hall. He just passed away like 2 years ago. He was in his 80s. He'd worked for the railroad for years. He'd worked as a cowboy before that. And he was a fiddle player, cranky, crusty old guy, you know? And I'm talking to Red in like the storeroom of Sterling's dad's convenience store in Browning. It's the only place we could find to hang out. And we're talking, and he's really cagey at first. He doesn't want to talk, you know? He's like, well, I'm not like, and finally, like we're going kind of back and forth. Nothing is really happening for about 45 minutes. It's like a really bad date, you know? And then he's like, well, I don't even know why you want to talk to me, because like I'm not an important person, you know? And I'm like, well, Red, you are. I mean, you are. You know, you know what, you lived through the 40s and 50s and 60s. You were an Indian man during relocation and termination, trying to live your life and get married and raise your kids and find work. You're an expert on what it was like to be alive at that time. I don't know what it was like. I wasn't even anyone's like worst nightmare, much less their, you know, my ancestors' dreams, you know, in the 1940s or 50s. You know what your life was like. That means you're an expert. That means you're important. And he's like, oh, well, I'm pretty good from 1936. I'm like, what happened in 1936? He's like, well, there was this flood. You know, and then he's off and going. We talked for days, you know, and I learned to hear in the stories he was telling, you know, I could hear the ring of history, you know, of federal policy, of his culture, of all sorts of things, you know. And And that kind of answers the last part of your question, which was like, I was constantly surprised at every turn, by this sort of wealth of experience, the creativity, the intelligence, and the beauty of all of the Native people that I got to talk to around the country. I spent like years being just impressed, by everybody. And honestly, it was like the best part of the project was not the part where I was sitting in a room by myself making stuff up, but when I got to go out and like talk to people, meet people, listen to them, really hear them, that was priceless. Yeah. So thank you very much. And I think that's it. Thank you all.